Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Millennial in the Middle. I'm Connor Dehlin. As always, thanks for listening. I just finished recording an interview with Morgan Reber. I loved this conversation and I'm really excited to share it with you. I met Morgan about a year ago. I'm going to explain the story of how we met here in just a minute. And I have always been so impressed with the way she thinks through things, with how she has the ability to question her party or beliefs or whatever it might be to try to find what matches her character. She is a very progressive Democrat and a feminist, and that's really at her core of how she views the world. And with that, today's conversation is a very good example of us not just taking the temptation to put ourselves in a box and to think, well, I am a Republican or I am a Democrat, so this is how I should feel about all these different things. Life's more complex than that, like we've talked about so many times on this podcast. And so what Morgan actually comes on and talks about today is how she feels about the question of abortion. Obviously, this has been top of mind over the last week, as many of you have watched the confirmation hearings of Amy Coney Barrett, and this is something that people are talking a lot about. A very strong, intelligent, powerful woman who did a fantastic job this week, and the concept or the topic that was discussed really more than anything else was abortion, was Roe v. Wade, being pro-life versus pro-choice. And Morgan talks about kind of her experience and her journey in this debate, where she ends up finding herself now. And I think a lot of you will be able to relate with a lot of things she says because you listen to this podcast. And this is, at the end of the day, where a lot of us find ourselves somewhere in the middle. So thanks for listening and enjoy this episode with Morgan Reber. All right, Morgan Reber, thanks so much for coming on today. I've been trying to get you on the podcast for a little bit, and thank you so much for coming on here today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You know, I think I've got to start. The way that we met, our story here, I think is kind of entertaining and a little interesting for the listeners out there. Last year, I went on a trip kind of last minute with some friends to Glacier National Park up in Montana. We rented an RV and there were 12 of us. I know that's probably illegal to have that many people in a motorhome, but 12 of us go. It's 6 guys, 6 girls. It felt more like Bachelor in Paradise, like RV style. And I remember the day one, we show up at Glacier to go on this hike and we park behind another motorhome because kind of there's the motorhome parking spots. And coming out of this motorhome, I swear, was clones of our group. There were 2 groups from Utah that both were going on these RV trips. And Morgan, you were in the other RV.
I was in the other RV.
And I remember, like, all of a sudden we start chatting with you in the parking lot. I actually knew a couple people that were on your trip, and you and I walking up the mountain. It was like a 15-mile hike. We basically took some time. I think our first connection was talking about Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
You're a huge Saturday Night Live fan, right?
I am, yeah. A little less recently, but in general, very much so.
We had our debate over like what were our favorite times and casts of SNL. I can't remember. What did you say? What was your favorite time period of SNL?
I think the Kristen Wiig, Andy Samberg era, but I also love the Will Ferrell era. So,
all right.
I don't know, kind of span that expanse, which is generally like most of the show, but
for sure. I'm a little more old school when it comes to my SNL. I love the Chris Farley, David Spade, Adam Sandler, those days, to see all those guys together in one. So anyway, we start talking SNL. Obviously, that starts leading to politics. And really over the last year, every time I've had a conversation with you about current events and politics, I've just been so impressed with your mentality, with the way you look at the world, your perspective. And I'm so excited to share a little bit of that with my audience today. I'll just ask you this first, a really broad question that I didn't prep you for. How do you feel right now about just like where we're at in the world of politics a couple weeks before the general election? Where's your head at with things?
Um, I think that I feel frustrated and disconnected from, I feel like, I don't know, I feel like everyone is a caricature of who voters actually are and how they actually feel. I feel like I have a pretty, well, I think that for a while I was in a little bit of an echo chamber with my other Democrat friends. And it can be easy to become a caricature, I think, if you're in an echo chamber, just because ideas get reinforced and reinforced and reinforced
Sure.
until they become a cartoon. But over the last 9 months, I would say I started deliberately making myself close with some very intelligent conservatives who, in the beginning, I think I fought a little bit with or kind of pushed back with, but I kind of saw, like, some of these people, like, they have master's degrees, like they make a ton of money, like they're extremely intelligent. and I began to see, like, there are other sides to these issues. And I think that something else that I saw, which was kind of interesting, as a Democrat, the media generally is on my side. And I typically can walk around feeling like I have the moral high ground. I kind of feel like for the longest time, I was like a bleeding heart liberal. And I kind of felt like I wore that as like a badge of pride. But when I started talking with some very, very intelligent, very well-informed conservatives, I saw, because they are so villainized by the media, they really have to know their stuff. Like, they really have to know how to argue their points, because I think that a lot of people look at conservatives like they're, like they're a stereotype, like the caricature of them, that they're completely motivated by religion and gun rights, and that they're like uneducated. And so I think that a lot of conservatives kind of have to break through that stereotype when they're talking to people, because it's very easy for us Democrats to kind of shut people down and say, well, like, you're a bigot. We have so many names that we can call other people to kind of shut down a conversation. We have so many bombs we can just explode a conversation with so that we don't have to have it. And that being said, I'm still a Democrat because that's the party I align the most with. But I've started feeling more and more distant from my party. I maybe about a year ago, I took this, like, there's like this quiz that you can take online, which is actually like very reputable. Normally quizzes aren't, but you can take this quiz online that kind of helps you to understand, like, which candidates you align the most with, which parties you align the most with. And I was kind of surprised to see my number one party that I aligned with actually wasn't the Democratic Party. It was the Green Party. And then after that, it was it was the Socialist Party. And then it was the Democratic Party. But I kind of thought that it was interesting. Like I think that sometimes I feel very aligned with the Democratic Party, and sometimes I feel like it is a sports team that is my team, but they're putting people up to bat, or like they're putting people up there to win that don't necessarily reflect all of the views within the Democratic Party. But I feel like the Democratic Party has gotten so extreme on some ends. Like I think just like the Republican Party, I think the Republican Party encompasses such a huge gamut of different viewpoints that even contradict each other. And the same thing with the Democratic Party. I mean, you got Bernie Sanders and AOC like over on one end, who kind of want like this like purist version of liberal ideology that I think is not going to win, personally. Like I like, there's a reason why Bernie Sanders did not get the nomination.
Yes. And why the Democratic establishment did not want him to get the nomination.
No, he would not have won, in my viewpoint. I don't think the majority of America wants that progressive of a government. And so I think that, like they kind of tried to play it safe. I feel like I've heard so many people say, well, I'd rather have the evil that I know than the evil that I don't, talking about Trump. And I think that that's kind of what the Democratic Party is kind of banking on with Biden. They're like, well, maybe if people remember Obama fondly, they'll vote for this guy. And so I do think it was a smart move to get a moderate, like a more moderate Democrat in there, because, obviously they're trying to scoop up conservatives who do not align themselves with Trump.
Yeah.
I think they picked the wrong guy. That's my viewpoint. I think that both Biden and Kamala Harris's history, they do not represent the values of progressives, I don't think.
Yeah.
But I also don't think that Donald Trump represents the values of conservatives. And I think that that's kind of a problem, is that we take them all together, but our candidates don't represent our values at this point.
Yeah.
They represent our teams, but not our values.
Wow. I think that's a really good way to put it. They represent our teams, not our values. And I love alliteration. Everyone makes fun of me. Like, the name of this podcast is Millennial in the Middle. And my thought as you were saying that was like, this is a disgruntled Democrat, right? And I think there's a lot of disgruntled Democrats. And then I'm sitting there while you're talking like, oh, what's my alliteration for Republicans? I just came up with this. Maybe this is dorky. I think there's a lot of like reticent Republicans, right?
Oh,
that don't want to all of a sudden take that full step. But at the end of the day, you're right. Like, you want your team to win. And so I think there's a lot of people in America, and frankly, I would put them in the middle somewhere, right? That feel I don't fully support this candidate, or I don't fully support what this party's doing. But at the end of the day, this is the decision I have to make, and this is the team I want to win.
Sure. Well, I think.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, there's kind of like a general understanding that voting for third party is a wasted vote, and a vote for the candidate like that you really don't want. And so it makes it really hard, because we have some really great third party candidates, but you feel almost like you're, I don't know, like kind of just giving up, or like you're voting with your heart, but not your brain, in a way.
For sure. I mean, I think you're right. If we stay with this team analogy, like, the game's between two teams. And if you wanted to root for the team out in the parking lot that had a lot of good ideas, that's great. But like, that's not the game, right? Like, if you want to be involved in what's happening, it's what's happening in the stadium right now with the fans. And unfortunately, our system just forces us to pick a side. And I think with that, often what happens is what team you're on determines how you feel about all these different issues, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I love having a lot of these conversations where it's like, this isn't a red or a blue matter, that there's more to this. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on today was I recently actually saw what you posted on Instagram, kind of in reaction to, obviously, with the Amy Coney Barrett hearings that we've watched this week, or that we've seen with her nomination and confirmation hearing, abortion was talked about a lot. And that is a topic that's all of a sudden become top of mind again for many Americans, and being debated and discussed. And I loved your mentality on kind of where you feel that stands right now. Tell us some of your thoughts there.
So I feel like abortion has always been a very difficult thing for me, because I feel like I should be pro-choice. I feel a lot of pressure to be pro-choice from my Democrat friends. I kind of feel like, in a way, all of us Democrats are kind of handed like a cheat sheet, where we're kind of told the answers of like how we should feel on different issues. Like, if you care about people, you should feel. And I think when it comes to like LGBTQ issues, like environmental issues, most women's rights issues, like, I am all the way there. For some reason, I have always had a hard time feeling settled about abortion. And I am actually not a particularly religious person. And so it's not coming from that. I think, so I have done quite a bit of research about abortion and about human development, kind of trying to understand how they all fit in together. And I think for a little while trying to convince myself that that kind of the ends justify the means, or the means aren't that big of a deal. And I think that I care about the end. And obviously, like the purpose of abortion and the reason why this matters to women is because motherhood is a great gift to many, but it's being unable to kind of control that biological aspect of your body. Whereas, like it just, there are so many issues with being a woman in the workforce and motherhood that just that can make motherhood an obstacle to your success. And so I think that abortion is seen as kind of like this quick fix. You can control what happens. Obviously contraception is not like 100%. The vast majority of abortions are elective abortions. And I think that that's something that needs to be made clear. The vast majority of abortions are not given to people who are victims of rape and incest. And the vast majority of abortions are actually given to people who already have children. And so it's more of like a timing issue and a financial issue. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I have always called myself a feminist. This is something that I care about quite a lot. I am a working woman. I'm unmarried, no kids. I care a lot about, I've fought systemic sexism in the workforce. I have seen how even just the perception of mothers versus fathers in the workforce, how it can push women down while it can boost men up. And so I feel like I understand why. But from a biological aspect and from a human rights aspect, this is something that I've really, really struggled with. So I've gone and I have researched like Princeton, EDU. I've researched like from so many very, very like reputable sources, like not like Christian blogs, which are fine, but maybe don't want to get your scientific facts from there. But I've researched from a scientific point of view. When does life begin? And there are studies that have shown that the vast majority of biologists agree that human development begins, or it's kind of a fact among biologists that human development begins when the sperm and the ovum come together to form a zygote, which is also like the embryonic stage. This is before it's a fetus, it's an embryo. But human development explodes at this point. And within like the first, I think is like 8 weeks, the first 6 to 8 weeks, the fetus or the embryo, like it develops like a heart and it's beating. And I think it's really important to take emotion out of this conversation, because I think that emotion can be used as a weapon in almost any conversation. Who cares more? Who can cry more? All those things. I think that they make a discussion unfair. But I think that for me, I'm very concerned with when does a human have rights? And that's not something that's ever been decided in our country. So it's very hard to have the discussion of, when is it murder or when is it manslaughter, to kill another American. It's almost like we're having this discussion out of order because we have not legally defined when life begins.
Yeah.
I would say that it's my personal opinion. I think that science is on the side of pro-life people in this debate. They, without using the Bible, without using anything else that's kind of subjective to someone's personal beliefs, they can point to biology and they can say human development begins at this precise point. And so that is when it is a human life. Human development ends at a certain point, and that is when death, and that is when someone is declared dead. And so they can kind of say, well, just from a biological standpoint, if it is a human, it should have rights. There is a discussion out there talking about rights are kind of earned gradually, and life happens gradually. I think that the difficulty with the discussion of whose rights matter more, or who has more rights, which humans have more rights. Sure. I think that can be kind of a hairy discussion. Do people who are older have more rights? Do people who are like that's like an ageist argument. There's also an
Yeah.
ableist argument. Do those with more abilities have more rights than those who are disabled? And I think that once we start getting into these, once we open the door to like these discussions, we kind of find ourselves a little bit in a mess. But it's important to have these discussions. We need to be able to say, well, if I'm aborting a fetus because it has Down syndrome, do I believe that those with Down syndrome have fewer rights? And I think that the discussion of whether or not the disabled deserve equal rights is actually a relatively new discussion. President Kennedy was actually the first president who signed laws into effect giving the disabled rights. My personal belief is that all living things have the right to life. And I see that as a very progressive belief. I believe that animals have the right to life. I believe that the disabled have a right to life. I believe that all life is precious. And I believe that especially human life is protected underneath the Constitution. And so it is really important for us to have the discussion about when life begins so that we can understand when is it appropriate to end it? When is it constitutional for it to be ended? And I think that the problem with my fellow Democrats, and this is a conversation I have tried to have so many times, and I have never, not a single time, come to like a good scientific argument for when life begins, if not at this point, with my fellow Democrats. I've tried to have the conversation about, okay, when does human life begin? When do humans deserve rights? And can you use science to back up that belief or that viewpoint? And I feel like it's really hard for us as liberals to kind of separate this from a women's rights issue. I think that we tend to talk about, well, a woman has a right to control her body. She absolutely does. But the discussion is whether or not what's going on inside of her body, this fetus, is it part of her body, or is it its own entity that is reliant upon her body? That's kind of the discussion there. Kind of like an interesting, I feel like there are so many different kind of like ethical like brain teasers, that people kind of put out to kind of help us all kind of understand, like, just like, is this ethical? Is this not ethical? One of them is, like, and this one is very difficult to talk about, but in the situation of a rape that results in a pregnancy, you have a rapist who's a perpetrator, the villain in this situation, and then you have two victims. The baby is not a willing participant, or the fetus is not like a willing participant in this interaction, and so it is not culpable. But the woman who is also a victim in this situation, if she were to turn around and shoot her rapist, she would go to jail. Unless it's like a situation of self-defense. If later she finds out that she's pregnant, goes to his door, knocks on the door, shoots him, she's going to prison.
Sure.
Like, that's a crime. But for some reason, it's not a crime. According to some, it's not a crime to end the life of the other victim who is not culpable in this situation. And I know that, like, it's a very difficult thing, because we need to be able to talk about, like, is it ethical to have abortions at certain times in certain circumstances, like when there's consent, when there's not consent. And generally all people believe, everyone who I've ever talked to believes that it is ethical to get an abortion if there has been rape or incest involved, if there has not been consent. I think an interesting question that I have not come to the answer to really is, if we do believe that human life begins at a point and that life is protected with rights underneath the law, does it matter how it was conceived? Do its rights matter less? And I don't really have the answer to those things, but I think we tend to shy away from some of these questions.
Yeah.
But I think that they're really important to talk about. And I think that in a situation where a pregnancy threatens the life of the mother, you could easily argue, well, it's self-defense. But I haven't really come to a conclusion to this particular argument, but I don't just want to look at it as a women's issue. I also want to look at it as a human rights issue. Yeah, but I do think that, like, as Democrats sometimes, or as, people who are pro-choice, we look at those who are pro-life, and we see, generally they're conservative, and we look at them and we say, well, we care about all these different demographics. We care about LGBTQ people. We care about minorities. We care about all these demographics. Why don't you care about these other people? Like we need to, fight for their rights, which I completely agree with. We also need to fight for animal rights. But I think that conservatives over here, they're looking at this issue from like a human rights perspective. They're not looking at this issue because they hate women and voting this way because, like, generally, like, there might be some fringe people out there, but they're looking at it as like a human rights issue, and they're looking at a demographic that they care about, and they're saying, well, what about their rights? What about their right to life? And so I do think that, like, that's kind of an important part for us all to kind of understand, so we can have this conversation.
Yeah, I think, one, I loved listening to you there. And I hope that those listening to this podcast episode learned a lot of what you just explained in your process, because what you just displayed was critical thinking, right? Of not realizing that this argument is one that is pro-life, pro-choice, pick a side, pick a team, there you are, end of story. That, like so many of these conversations and issues that we have now, they're so complex. There's a lot to it. But I think the second thing that's so admirable about what you just did is you're willing to question your own beliefs, your own parties, or those that think the same way you do, or those that would be labeled in the same group, in air quotes, questioning like, hey, well, why do we believe this? And are there things that I might kind of question and take to that next step? And I think that's such a good lesson for all of us when it comes to politics in general, rather than just jumping to the talking points or name calling or whatever it might be. Like, this issue requires us to peel back lots of layers. There's lots to it. And, I think that is a really good thing to just promote in society. And I'm glad that you just shared that. Any other thoughts kind of on this abortion argument? Because there's a couple of things I want to talk about, kind of feminism and women's rights in general here, before we wrap up. Any other thoughts?
I think that I'm trying to remember who was it who said this, but I remember I was reading this one feminist text, or I was reading this one article, and it was talking about how the sexual revolution had two goals. Or like kind of like the giant feminist movement during that time kind of had two goals. And one of them was to kind of allow women to operate in our country in a way that is more similar to men, having more similar rights and similar privileges. And in large part, I do feel like we've come at least close to arriving at that point. But the other goal was for women, as they are, for things that are considered feminine, like traditionally feminine, for those to be respected as much as the things that are masculine. And the person writing this article was saying how that was never accomplished.
Yeah.
And I do agree with that. And I think that like with the issue of abortion, certain things are seen as feminist and certain things are not. Certain women are seen as feminist while other women are not. I think that it's really easy to say, well, you hate women because you don't agree with me. Whereas there are women who feel very passionately about their motherhood, and they feel very passionately about the way that they see like their babies and their fetuses and a connection that they experience. And so I think that there's a whole lot of really charged feelings here that make it very difficult to talk about. And I think that talking with those who have never had children, talking with those who have had abortions, talking with those who have had miscarriages, you're going to get like kind of a very like wide range of feeling. And I think that when you talk about women's choices and protecting women's choices, I've talked to some women who feel like 50% of pregnancies, like they tend to be pregnant with a girl. And those are girls who will never have an opportunity to have a choice. Like their choices are taken away from them at birth. And there are some women who see it like that. And I feel like the more I've opened myself up to kind of understanding different viewpoints from an emotional perspective, but also from like a scientific and like legal perspective using critical thinking, I think that not everyone fits nicely into the boxes that the other side would place them in, I guess.
Yeah.
That was kind of a roundabout way of saying that.
No, I think you're spot on. And that's really what we point out over and over and over again in this podcast, of this whole concept of being in the middle of life, being in the middle of very tough topics and conversations, and trying to find where you stand. Just for our listeners to kind of give some clarity and context to this conversation as well. I always like to tie some history in here. And I do think it's interesting that, obviously we're discussing this right now because it's come up with the confirmation hearings of Amy Coney Barrett. And this will be the first time that there's really a woman confirmed to the Supreme Court, if it happens, that is unapologetically pro-life. And what's interesting is, we hear a lot about Roe v. Wade. And, for those listening, this is the Supreme Court case in 1973 that was basically in the state of Texas, a woman that wanted an abortion. And that was that first time that it was fought all the way to the Supreme Court. And I think there's even misunderstanding of Roe v. Wade, where often people think, oh, that just means abortion is legal. It still had its stipulations. But the main thing that Roe v. Wade came out and shared is that it was a woman's right to privacy that superseded anything else. What's interesting about that is that decision was made by 9 men in 1973, right? Like there had never been a woman on the Supreme Court. And it wasn't until 1981, 8 years later, that Ronald Reagan nominated Sandra Day O'Connor to be the first female Supreme Court justice. And this is pretty monumental now to have, a woman on the Supreme Court that has not hidden the fact that she is pro-life. And it's interesting, in the 2016 debates between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump was asked, do you see Roe v. Wade being overturned? And he said, I just listened to this morning. He said, well, if there are 2 or 3 justices that I'm able to appoint, I will appoint pro-life justices. And I could see that happening. And as luck or whatever you want to say it would happen, there are 3 justices that will now be on the court that are Donald Trump's appointees, that are his nominees. And I think this is something we're about to hear a lot about over the next little bit, no matter who wins. If Trump wins, I think then it'll be really a continuation of that. And if Biden wins, there will be a fight to whether it's packing the court or changing that or whatever it might be to stop that. And so I think this is something we all need to start thinking of in that deeper sense, like you just told us there. And hopefully it leads to some better conversations as they come.
Definitely. Obviously I think that appointing a justice at so close to the election, I think that I don't know about how ethical that was. Especially when we look backwards at Obama and when he tried to do the same thing and then he didn't.
Oh, don't point out the hypocrisy, Morgan. You can't do that.
I don't see anyone, or I don't know, but I do think I haven't watched all of the hearings, but I've watched enough to kind of get a sense of Amy Coney Barrett and who she is. I've done a good amount of research about her. I have to say, I do respect her. And part of that, I feel like she was continuously questioned about how she would vote on different issues during the hearings. And She was very professional in her answers, and people say, oh, well, she like dodged the answers. But I think that they might misunderstand the role of a Supreme Court justice.
Sure.
Their role is not like, they're not senators. They're not up there kind of like being elected and like responsible to the people who elect them. They're not up there and saying like, well, I'm coming into this issue with some like kind of preset, opinions, and I'm going to vote according to those opinions.
Yeah.
And she kind of emphasized that, that like as a Supreme Court justice, it is her responsibility to review the case as it is, not to come in and say, well, I feel this way. And I think that like the way that she said it was kind of nice, to like something about like, well, I'm not a queen, I can't kind of walk in here and decide one day, well, this is how I feel on this issue, and so this is how I'm always going to vote. It's her responsibility as a Supreme Court justice to kind of go in and take it case by case and review whether or not the case is constitutional, whether or not it is, it's cohesive with our laws. It's not her responsibility, or it is very much against her responsibility to go in and say, well, I am pro-life, and so I'm always going to vote this way. And I think that was a very kind of professional response from her. Yeah. And that is her role as a Supreme Court justice. I think also, when people talk about how she, made some sort of very public statement that she would always support the right to life from conception to natural birth, I think that people need to understand that the context for that document, she was at her church, and there was a document being passed around that was kind of like for all the congregation. It was supposed to be just kind of like a personal, like, yes, I'm with the church on this one. And so she said it's not like she's out here trying to like make a statement. It was kind of like a private thing within her church. Yeah. Being pro-life does not mean being anti-woman, though. And I think that that's something that people need to understand. I don't think that her being pro-life automatically means that she will vote this way or that way on Roe v. Wade. I think that she's going to be looking at every detail of the case. And I think that there's kind of an important distinction there. I think also just kind of looking at the character of Amy Coney Barrett. I don't agree with her on everything. Obviously, she's a conservative Catholic. I'm not. We're going to have some like different views, but I think looking at her life, if you see a woman who has had so much success in her career, what does she have, like 8 kids? 2 of them are adopted. Yeah. She is by default a feminist. In my book, if she is someone who, is not confined by gender norms, is not like, you look at her, I don't see her as being oppressed. I see her as someone who has been supported in her dreams and has risen extremely high, astronomically high in her career. And I think that it is important to raise up women from all walks of life so that all girls and all people can look and say, well, here we have on our side some very powerful women making important decisions. It's important that it's not just liberal women who are risen to positions of power. We need conservative women who are also risen to positions of power, who are also giving a voice. It's very important that it's not just middle-aged white men who are speaking out for conservatives, because then it becomes like a misogynist party. We don't want it to be a misogynist party. We want it to be filled with voices of women and voices of minorities. And I think that that's important. Like, people, sometimes they look at the conservative party and they're like, oh, well, this is like the party of oppression. And the way that I look at it is, from like the majority of conservatives that I know, they are people who really, really understand economics. And so they're normally coming from an economic point of view, whereas I feel like many liberals are coming from a social point of view. And they're just different topics that like we're focusing on and that are important to us and that we're researching. And so I don't know. I see Amy Coney Barrett as an opportunity for conservative families, to have someone to like look up to, like their daughters can look up to this woman and say, okay, well, I want to be a Supreme Court justice someday. I want to do that and be a mom. I can be both. And she is showing me how I can be both. And I think that right there is kind of at least for me personally, I grow up, I grew up feeling like I have to choose. Like I can't have both. And so I think that there's kind of this syndrome with women where if we also want to be mothers, we tend to quit jobs that we don't even have yet. Because we feel like we can't do both, or we have to compromise, or we have to sacrifice, and we want to do really, really well at both things. And it's kind of told to us that we can't. I mean, studies have shown that, when women are in the workforce and they have pictures out of their families, they are seen as being distracted. Whereas when men have pictures out of their families, they are seen as being great family men who are responsible. There are stigmas in our society where people believe that women can't do both successfully. And so I think it is important to raise up women who are doing both successfully so that women don't stop having ambition even when they also want to be mothers. Every man that I've talked to who wants to be a family man, who wants to have kids, or who does have kids, there's no overwhelming feeling of compromise there. They've always known that they can do both and that they can do both well. And in a way, they kind of feed into each other, where if I'm going to be a good dad, I'm going to be, a good executive, I'm going to be a good this, I'm going to be a good that. I can be all of these things. Nobody tells them that they can't do both. Whereas I still struggle feeling like, okay, well, I am, I put just as much energy and time into my job as my male married coworkers. And they're great dads and they're doing this. But I see how one of the reasons why they're able to do this and do such a good job at it is because their wives are at home. And I don't know, I have some men that I've worked with who have managed to do excellent at their jobs. They have several side projects and hobbies, and they're doing so much creatively with themselves. And they're able to do that because there is kind of an uneven balance of parental duties. And so their wives are at home feeling creatively stifled, or they're feeling like I got to do more. And sometimes the husbands come to work and they're like, man, I got to figure out a good hobby for my wife. I call them mom hobbies. There's kind of a good set of, pretty recurring mom hobbies that, moms feel like they can have at the same time as staying at home. And I feel kind of frustrated with that idea that you can't do both, because there is a need for compromise there. And so when we do see these unions between men and women, I think that RBG and her husband, Marty, they're a great example of compromise there. They were parents, and she was able to do everything that she wanted to do in life and do it very, very well. And so was he. And so there was kind of a working together there. And I think that it's very important for women to have those examples. It's going to be hard, but it's going to be made easier when also men can see examples, especially conservative men who may be this is, not as common for them. If they're only seeing women that they disagree with up there and, kind of put up on the public stage, very successful women.
They're on the other team.
Yeah. They're on the other team. They can't relate to that experience. And well, maybe they're not good mothers because they don't feel the same way that I do. Yeah. But if they see someone who they can respect and they say, well, that's a good mom and she's able to do both, maybe I should put in more effort so that my wife can become like that, or my, my whoever can become like that. I think that that's important.
No, I love that. And I think that's a great kind of ending message for this, of that mindset of having us be more open to, hey, if you're a feminist, you got to root for women on all sides, right?
Yes.
And if being someone that wants equality doesn't make you a Democrat, or that doesn't make you a Republican, right? You can be conservative and still fight for LGBTQ plus rights, or still care about the environment. And I think that's a really, really good perspective of looking at that. And frankly, I think it's very mature of you to realize that, hey, while I don't disagree with this person, everything they do, I realize that they have the potential to do a lot of good. And so I'll root for that. That's a universal human thing.
For sure. I recently, I think it was BuzzFeed. They did a series of videos where they took kind of like one very homogenous group, or they seemed very homogenous. But some of them were Democrats, some of them were Republicans, and then they had them argue. And there was one that they did where it was Black Americans who were Republican and who were Democrat. And it was so, I think that as a Democrat, I tend to think, well, every minority should vote Democrat, because we care about them. But I think that it's not like seeing their race as their like defining factor, I think in a way kind of minimizes them, and not thinking, well, maybe they have different economic, viewpoints, maybe they have different,
Sure.
Like maybe they're coming from like a different point of view. But there was a gay Black man arguing in favor of Republican ideologies. And it was kind of eye-opening to me to see, like, we are all made of so many different values and like so many different like viewpoints. Like we don't fit into these boxes. And to kind of say, well, like, you're like this, and so you should be here. You're a feminist, so you should be here. Like, you're in favor of this, so you should be here. I think that like kind of like this team mentality, when like different people automatically belong on different teams, and then they're kind of given that messaging. So like they believe it. They're like, well, I believe in gun rights, I should be a Republican, or I am, I support women, I should be here. I think that it's really important to break these things up issue by issue, because I mean, like from my viewpoint, like I would consider myself pro-life, but I also consider myself, I champion all human rights. I'm very much in favor of gay marriage. I'm very much in favor of transgender rights. Like, I see these things as all going together. And so I think that sometimes these values are kind of like broken up and like fractured in a way. And sometimes they don't always belong to like the right people, like it feels like. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important to say, well, I'm going to take this issue by issue, and I'm really going to do my research and see like how I feel about it. And I'm not going to use like the cheat sheet. I use that term because that was actually a real thing. Like there was a pretty like prominent liberal influencer who made a voting cheat sheet. So the Democrats would know who to vote for without doing the research themselves. And I feel like that is so harmful. People need to be doing their own research and figuring out what issues are important to them and why. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, I love that mentality. I think we keep having these conversations, and I feel like the whole goal of this podcast continues to be reinforced over and over. And I hope for everyone listening today, take a look in the mirror and, kind of check in on yourself. What does matter most to you? And are you just focused on that cheat sheet? Are you just relying on the names that we call each other or the talking points that we hear over and over? Or do you think this is why this matters to me and this is why I feel that way? And once you get to that point, that's where the conviction happens. And that's because it's your thought, it's your feeling rather than someone else's. So thank you so much for joining, Morgan. I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and who knows, maybe we'll continue and do I think your perspective, maybe we'll chat again at a later time. So thanks for doing it.
Thank you for having me.
I end every episode the same way. And she said, you told me, you're like, I'll think about if I'm going to join along. So I'm going to start, and you tell me if you want to join. Clowns to the left me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. If you guys are listening, or if you're listening and not watching it on YouTube, Morgan just gave me a look midway through that, like, it's not happening. Oh, man. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it, everyone. Have a good one. Clowns to the left.